Now, before I leave you, I think I want to talk about some of the difficulties here, and there are many of them. And I tried to give a kind of an appreciation, not just a criticism of Freud, because there's a lot here that is worthwhile. But I think, first off, that all the biological, positivistic, scientistic readings of Freud are all wrong. So everybody who wants Freud to be a scientist, I just think that's completely impossible. And I think it's a big misreading. And I think once we get beyond that misreading, we can really begin to appreciate him. So let's first of all think about the problem of falsifiability. Karl Popper and the whole school of Vienna Circle, and the later neo-positivistic kind of thinkers all have a common set of objections to things like Freudian psychology. They say, how can you test this? Can you falsify it? The argument is something like this. For every proposition about nature in inductive or in scientific research, there's always some way we can test, and specifically some way we can falsify our hypotheses. So we say things like, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, which in fact it does. Now if you have any doubt about that, let's just go to the lab, and I'll get out a Bunsen burner, I'll get out some water and a thermometer, and well, there we go. It boils at 100 degrees centigrade. What do you want me to say? Physics speaks with one voice, and we know how we get the answers. And if you have any doubt about anything that I claim to be a physical fact, I know how to go back and test it. Go to the lab. Now here's the problem. With Freud, even though he wants to hold on to this idea of scientific reduction to biochemical states, if you were to ask Professor Freud, how do you know that in all dreams, when you have a dream about an unknown stranger, how do you know it's always your father? Well, you can't go to the lab and find that out. There's no test you could possibly do. So the scientific critics will say, well, look, if you can't test it, then it has the same status as, say, religion, or if you want to be more charitable, the same status as literary criticism. It's one way of interpreting the world, but there's no way to insist and pound on the desk, this is the only way. There are actually a plurality of possible interpretations. Right? So it does, in other words, Freudian psychiatry does not speak with one voice the way we would like physics to speak. It offers us a plurality of possible hermeneutics, of possible perspectives. All right? This means that it is never going to get to that scientific certainty, or at least that scientific univocality that most of us long for. So I think that the attempt to read this as a kind of scientific activity is just wrong, and it runs into all kinds of problems. For example, do you really analyze dreams in the way you analyze blood? I think it's a metaphorical sort of analysis. I know what you do when you analyze blood. You break it into its component chemical parts. It's not what you do when you analyze a dream. You don't put it into a centrifuge and whirl it around. What you do when you analyze a dream is that if Professor Freud or Dr. Freud asks you to free associate, and he uses free association as a way of kind of fishing for the translation scheme for your dream, your dream's manifest content into its latent content. And when he's fished enough, and he feels like he can interpret your dream, then he's done. Now the difficulty is this. Freud himself said that dreams were a product of the process called condensation. We get lots of different things and symbolize them in one thing, like, you know, the alligator that was trying to eat me in my dream or something like that. Here's a difficulty. Assuming that we go for condensation and the correlative idea overdetermination, that the crocodile in my dream was caused by many feelings that I have, how do we know that when we've exhausted the interpretation of this dream? It's an endless process, literally. In practice, the way Professor Freud knew that he had finished interpreting a dream is when he said he was finished. Now I understand the dream, and now it's interpreted. The question is, different psychologists using different questions in free association might come up with different interpretations because it's overdetermined. You never get to the end of interpreting any one dream. So there's no way of knowing how to logically close this off. And this points to something that I want to emphasize. Aristotle's idea of phronesis. Aristotle, great philosopher, thought that all moral judgment involves something called phronesis, which is translated into English as judgment. In other words, you have to have a certain amount of judgment. There's no one formula for right and wrong. I mean, we can get certain parameters to it, but the nitty-gritty of it resists formulaic treatment. Well, may I suggest that psychoanalysis is the same kind of thing? It involves a certain kind of judgment. And I wouldn't want anybody to become a psychoanalyst that didn't have what I would describe as good judgment. But the difficulty is that I can imagine people having good judgment, but not completely agreeing about everything. All right? And what that means is that we can never eliminate the phronesis, the subjective element to psychoanalysis. This is another reason why it resists the possibility of being turned into a hard-shell natural science. My estimation is that Freud grew up in late 19th century German-speaking Europe and developed in early 20th century German-speaking Europe at a time and a place where science was at its all-time epistemological high. Everybody genuflected, to the shrine of science. What I think Freud did was kind of metaphorically put on the white lab coat so he could get his treatment of the internal facts of the psyche taken seriously. Right? I think that it is a mistake to try and do that now. When we look back on it, most of the claims won't work if we want to read it as a scientific activity. Part of this problem comes from the German word science, too. I guess I should note this. Those of you who have the German, the word for science is Wissenschaft. And in English, we call science science. Now, when we talk about science nowadays, just in common ordinary language, English, where we use it, we mean things like physics and chemistry, maybe biology, and astronomy and things like that. We don't mean things like literary criticism. Usually we wouldn't call that a science. And most people wouldn't call theology a science, right? Whatever you want to call it. Well, in German, it doesn't work that way. They don't parse knowledge like that. The German word Wissenschaft means an organized body of knowledge. That includes things like physics and chemistry and astronomy. But for the Germans, there's also things like Literaturwissenschaft, which is literary criticism in our language. There's also Theologiewissenschaft, theological science. In that sense of the word science, yes, psychoanalysis and Freud's whole project is scientific. It's an organized body of knowledge, in the sense that literary criticism is an organized body of knowledge. But like literary criticism, it is multivocal. It is a system of interpreting things which does not exclude the possibility of other systematic interpretations. It is like literary criticism or theology. Right? In that sense, it is scientific. It is not scientific in the sense that physics is scientific. The unconscious is not an entity in the sense that the liver is an entity. Right? When you stop making those category mistakes, you can begin to really appreciate what a great thinker Freud is. Right? Because he's talking about something, the internal contents of our psyche, that just resists strict, hard-shell scientific discussion. In other words, I know what it's like to talk about atoms or chemicals, because they're out there and they're in the public domain, and so is language. When I start to talk about my fears, my loves, my hates, my dreams, my lusts, all that kind of stuff, I'm taking something that's private and internal and trying and making it external. And the problem is that language has a very hard time making the jump from what's inside me to what's outside here. Right? This intrinsically and always generates a certain degree of ambiguity. And it also generates a certain category of entities for which our speaker is going to have a hard time giving a satisfactory scientific account. Well, what's a good scientific account of guilt or lust? I mean, I think it's a regulative rule 1,000 centuries from now we may find out that it's a chemical. But between now and then, what are we supposed to do? A very sensible observation. So what Freud is trying to do is offer us a Wissenschaft of the mind, an organized body of knowledge which interprets things that had previously not been interpreted, and which also brings together a range of phenomena which we might have thought were completely meaningless, like hand washing or dreams, and connects them all together with one universal or one general idea, one general concept. So what he does is bring together things we hadn't thought was possible to bring together before. And that's what his great achievement is, in my view. Freud, I think, is one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. I know that that's an unusual reading, and I know it may be thought of as a denigration of Freud, and I don't intend it that way. The way I mean it is this. I think that it represents something that you can really learn. I think you can learn things from literature, and I think you can learn things from poetry. I think that the people that want this to be a science are the ones who think that really all knowledge is physics. I think that's just wrong. Just plain wrong. You're never going to find out about guilt and good and evil and love and hate from physics. That's just the way it is. You can find things like that out, but we find things like that in a poetic way, through literature. What this is one of the great literary achievements of the 20th century. He invented a new kind of lyric poetry. We talk about love and emotion and stuff like that in a way which shows the influence of 19th century German scientific philosophy. So he tries to force the stuff of lyric poetry into the form of 19th century German positivism. What you get is a very influential but highly, how can I put it? A system with many great internal contradictions and internal tensions. The richness and greatness of Freud's achievement lies in the fact that he found these contradictions fruitful rather than sterile. He found them a road inward rather than a dead end to nowhere.